Elizabeth Thornwell stood at the window of her late brother's plantation house, watching the Spanish moss sway in the Georgia breeze. The reading of Jonathan's will had concluded an hour ago, leaving her mistress of Willow Creek estate and guardian to her three nieces, Charlotte 17, Abigail 15, and Mary 13. The girls had been left motherless years before, and now fatherless, with only their formidable aunt to guide them. "Miss Elizabeth," Samuel, the house steward, spoke from the doorway. "The girls are waiting in the parlor, as you requested." Elizabeth nodded, smoothing her black mourning dress. "Very good. I'll be there presently." As she made her way through the grand hall of Willow Creek, Elizabeth contemplated her new position. Jonathan had left considerable debts, but the plantation itself was valuable. The cotton harvest would bring income, and the 46 enslaved people represented significant capital. Still, Elizabeth required more to maintain the lifestyle she envisioned. The three Thornwell girls rose when Elizabeth entered the parlor. Charlotte, the eldest, had her father's determined jaw and intelligent eyes. Abigail, delicate and fair, resembled their mother. Young Mary, still childlike with her round face, clutched a small cloth doll. "Sit," Elizabeth commanded. The girls obeyed immediately. "You understand that your father's passing has changed everything. This house and all within it now belong to me." Charlotte spoke carefully. "Father said we would always have a home here." "And so you shall," Elizabeth replied, her voice cool and measured. "But you must earn your keep. There are debts to pay, and Willow Creek requires proper management." "We'll help however we can, Aunt," Abigail offered softly. Elizabeth's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "You're of marriageable age, Charlotte. Abigail soon will be. Mary in time. Your father's connections in Savannah society will open doors to suitable matches." Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. "I had hoped to continue my studies." "Foolishness," Elizabeth snapped. "Women have no need for excessive education. Your purpose is to secure advantageous marriages that will benefit this estate." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken protest. Outside, a mockingbird called, its varied notes incongruously cheerful against the tension in the room. "You will begin attending social functions next month, once the initial mourning period has passed," Elizabeth continued. "I have already received inquiries about your availability from several prominent families." Mary looked up, her young face confused. "But what about Charlotte's writing? Father always said—" "Your father indulged you all excessively," Elizabeth cut in. "That ends now. This plantation must prosper, and you three are assets to be utilized." As darkness fell over Willow Creek that night, Charlotte stood at her bedroom window, watching the lanterns being lit along the path to the slave quarters. Her father had been a relatively benevolent master by the standards of 1843 Georgia, but she harbored no illusions about Aunt Elizabeth's character. "Charlotte," Abigail whispered, slipping into the room, "what will happen to us?" Charlotte pulled her younger sister close. "We'll endure. Father taught us to be strong." "I overheard the cook talking," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "She said Aunt Elizabeth sold 2 people already, Moses and his daughter Lily. They were taken away this afternoon while we were upstairs." Charlotte's breath caught. Moses had been at Willow Creek longer than she'd been alive. "We have to be careful, Abby, very careful." Later that night, Charlotte crept downstairs, drawn by voices from her father's study. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed Aunt Elizabeth with a man she didn't recognize. Tall, expensively dressed with cold eyes. "The eldest has spirit that needs breaking," Elizabeth was saying. "But properly managed, she'll bring a substantial bride price from the right family." "And if she resists?" the man asked. Elizabeth's laugh was like glass breaking. "There are always ways to ensure compliance, Mr. Blackwood. Always ways." Charlotte retreated silently, her heart pounding. In the shadows of Willow Creek, she understood with sudden clarity that they were no longer simply bereaved children. They had become commodities in their aunt's ruthless calculations. Within a fortnight of Elizabeth Thornwell's arrival at Willow Creek, the plantation transformed. Gone were the books Jonathan had encouraged his daughters to read. In their place, instructional manuals on proper feminine deportment. The girls' colourful dresses were replaced with sombre, restrictive garments that Elizabeth deemed appropriate for young ladies seeking respectable matches. Charlotte's resistance began with small acts of defiance, hiding her father's books beneath loose floorboards, writing by candlelight after the household retired. But Elizabeth proved unnervingly observant. "What's this?" she demanded one morning, holding up Charlotte's journal, discovered during an inspection of the girls' rooms. "Scribbling nonsense instead of practicing your needlework." Charlotte stood rigid. "Those are private thoughts, Aunt." "Nothing in this house is private from me," Elizabeth replied, dropping the journal into the fireplace. The flames consumed the pages instantly. "Your father's indulgence has made you willful. That ends now." The following day, Charlotte found herself paired with Hezekiah Blackwood, the man from the study, at a luncheon in Savannah. He was 43 to her 17, a widower with shipping interests and political connections. "Your aunt speaks highly of your domestic capabilities," Blackwood remarked, his eyes assessing Charlotte as one might evaluate livestock. "My interests extend beyond the domestic sphere, sir," Charlotte replied carefully. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A spirited nature can be redirected with proper guidance." Later, in the carriage returning to Willow Creek, Elizabeth gripped Charlotte's wrist painfully. "You will encourage Mr. Blackwood's attentions. His offer would settle your father's debts entirely." "He's older than my father was," Charlotte protested. "Age brings wisdom and connections," Elizabeth countered. "Your romantic notions are childish fantasies." That evening Abigail found Charlotte in the garden, tears streaming down her face. "What happened in Savannah?" she asked, sitting beside her sister on the stone bench. "Aunt Elizabeth intends to sell me like one of the field hands," Charlotte whispered, "to a man who looks at me like I'm property." Abigail's face paled. "We could run away. And go where? With what money?" Charlotte shook her head. "And I won't leave you and Mary behind." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Cooper, the overseer Elizabeth had recently hired. His reputation for brutality preceded him, and several enslaved people already bore marks from his whip. "Miss Charlotte, Miss Abigail," he greeted them with a tip of his hat that did nothing to disguise the contempt in his eyes. "Your aunt requests your presence in the main house. You shouldn't be wandering unsupervised." As they walked ahead of him, Charlotte felt his gaze burning into her back. The sense of being hunted intensified. Inside, they found Elizabeth with Mary, who was sobbing quietly. "Your sister has been caught giving food to that pregnant girl in the quarters," Elizabeth explained coldly. "Hannah, I believe they call her. She's expecting any day," Mary said through tears, "and they cut her rations." "Silence," Elizabeth snapped. "The management of the workers is not your concern. As punishment, you'll forfeit dinner for a week." Charlotte stepped forward. "Aunt, she's 13, and you'll join her in this punishment for questioning my authority," Elizabeth finished. "Mr. Cooper, ensure they remain in their rooms this evening." As the overseer escorted them upstairs, he leaned close to Charlotte. "Your aunt has given me permission to enforce discipline as I see fit, Miss Charlotte. Remember that." That night, Charlotte heard a commotion from the slave quarters. Peering through her window, she saw lanterns moving in the darkness. Hannah was in labor, and from the frantic movements, something was wrong. Charlotte made a decision. Slipping past the sleeping house servant Elizabeth had posted in the hall, she retrieved medical supplies and made her way to the quarters. If she couldn't escape her aunt's plans yet, she could at least offer what help she could. As dawn broke, Charlotte returned to the main house, exhausted but triumphant. Hannah had delivered healthy twin boys, But her small victory evaporated when she found Elizabeth waiting in the entrance hall, Thomas Cooper at her side. "I see discipline requires a firmer hand," Elizabeth said, her voice colder than a January frost. "Mr. Cooper, make the necessary arrangements. Charlotte will be departing for Savannah tomorrow to stay with the Blackwoods. Perhaps their supervision will prove more effective than mine." The Blackwood mansion in Savannah stood like a fortress against the backdrop of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Charlotte's carriage passed through wrought iron gates that clanged shut behind her with ominous finality. The 3-week visit her aunt had arranged felt unmistakably like exile, or worse, inspection before purchase. Mrs. Winthrop, the severe housekeeper, showed Charlotte to a well-appointed room on the 2nd floor. "Mr. Blackwood expects you for tea at 4. You'll find appropriate attire in the wardrobe." Charlotte opened the mahogany doors to discover dresses far more elaborate than anything she'd worn before, all in pale colors that emphasized innocence and youth. The intended message was clear. She was being packaged for presentation. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 4, Charlotte descended the stairs in a pale blue gown that felt like a costume. Hezekiah Blackwood awaited her in a parlor overlooking a manicured garden. "Miss Thornwell," he greeted her, his smile practiced, "I trust you're settling in comfortably." "The accommodations are generous," Charlotte replied carefully. Blackwood gestured to the tea service. "Your aunt tells me you have a talent for the pianoforte. Perhaps you'll favor me with a performance after tea." The conversation proceeded with excruciating politeness. Blackwood inquiring about her education, her household skills, her health, as if completing a checklist. Charlotte answered with equal precision, revealing nothing of her inner turmoil. After playing several pieces on the grand piano, Charlotte was permitted to retire early, to recover from her journey. Once alone, she began a systematic exploration of her new surroundings, testing which doors were locked, which windows might provide escape if necessary. On the 3rd day of her stay, Charlotte discovered the library, a vast room with floor-to-ceiling shelves that would have delighted her father. She was examining a volume of Shakespeare when a voice startled her. Most young ladies prefer novels of romance to the bard's tragedies. Charlotte turned to find an elderly man watching her from a leather armchair, thin, elegantly dressed, with intelligent eyes that reminded her painfully of her father. "I'm Edward Blackwood," he introduced himself, "Hezekiah's uncle and, I fear, an unwelcome remnant in this household." "Charlotte Thornwell," she replied, replacing the book. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Nonsense. Few use this room any more except myself." He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Tell me, Miss Thornwell, how do you find Savannah?" Something in his manner, a genuine interest unlike his nephew's calculating assessment, prompted Charlotte's honesty. "Beautiful but confining, sir." Edward Blackwood's laugh held no mockery. An apt description of most beautiful things in this society. He studied her face. "You're here as a prospective bride for my nephew, I presume?" Charlotte's silence confirmed his suspicion. "I thought as much," the old man sighed. "Hezekiah has specific requirements for his next wife. His first, poor Margaret, failed to provide an heir before consumption claimed her." Over the next week, Charlotte and Edward Blackwood formed an unlikely alliance. In their daily meetings in the library, he revealed the history of the Blackwood family, including Hezekiah's ruthless business practices and his desperation for a male heir to secure his legacy. "He has 2 daughters from his first marriage," Edward explained one rainy afternoon, "sent to boarding school in Charleston immediately after their mother's death. He considers them disappointing investments." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "And what of his business associates? A Mr. Cooper, perhaps?" Edward's expression darkened. "Thomas Cooper? A deplorable individual who handles Hezekiah's more problematic transactions. I advise keeping your distance." That night, unable to sleep, Charlotte noticed unusual activity in the courtyard below her window. Men were unloading crates from a wagon, moving with the furtive haste of those avoiding detection. Among them stood Thomas Cooper, directing operations with brutal efficiency. The following morning, Charlotte feigned illness to avoid breakfast with Hezekiah. Once the household was occupied, she slipped down to investigate the cellars where the crates had been taken. Using a passageway Edward had mentioned, she made her way through the servants' areas and down stone steps that grew increasingly damp. The locked door at the bottom yielded to a hairpin, a trick Charlotte's father had taught her years ago. Beyond lay not wine cellars as expected, but a holding area with iron restraints bolted to the wall and the unmistakable stench of human misery. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth in horror. The Blackwoods were involved in illegal slave trading, importing Africans despite the 1808 ban, keeping them hidden until they could be dispersed to plantations, claiming they were the offspring of existing enslaved people. As she turned to flee, Charlotte collided with a solid form. Thomas Cooper stood blocking her exit, his expression a mixture of triumph and malice. "Curiosity is a dangerous trait in a young lady," he remarked, gripping her arm painfully. "Mr. Blackwood will be most disappointed by your behavior. He'll be more concerned about federal authorities discovering this operation," Charlotte countered, struggling to maintain her composure. Cooper's laugh echoed against the stone walls. "Who do you think protects operations like this, Miss Thornwell? Your aunt was right. You require significant correction before you'll make a suitable wife." As he dragged her upstairs toward Hezekiah's study, Charlotte realized with growing dread that her aunt hadn't sent her to Savannah merely as a prospective bride. She had sold her into a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. Charlotte sat rigidly at the small writing desk in her room, now effectively her prison. 2 weeks had passed since her discovery in the cellars, and Hezekiah Blackwood's reaction had been worse than she anticipated. Rather than denying his illegal activities, he detailed them with chilling pride, along with his expectations for Charlotte as his future wife. "Your role is simple," he had explained, his voice as cold as his eyes. "Provide heirs, maintain an impeccable social presence, and remain silent about business matters that don't concern you." When Charlotte had threatened to expose him, Blackwood merely smiled. "Your aunt has already received a substantial advance on our arrangement. Should you prove uncooperative, the consequences would fall most heavily on your sisters." Now Charlotte wrote her weekly letter to Abigail and Mary under the watchful eye of Mrs. Winthrop. Every word was carefully censored, every plea for help disguised within innocent observations about Savannah society. "I hope this letter finds you well," Charlotte wrote, pressing harder on certain letters, a code she and Abigail had developed as children. "The weather here remains oppressive, though Mr. Blackwood assures me one grows accustomed to the confinement of city life." A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. Mrs. Winthrop answered it, then turned to Charlotte. "Mr. Edward requests your company in the library, Miss Thornwell." The housekeeper escorted Charlotte downstairs, where Edward Blackwood waited among his books. Since her confrontation with Hezekiah, Charlotte had been forbidden to visit the library alone, a particular cruelty given her love of reading. "Thank you, Mrs. Winthrop. I'll ring when Miss Thornwell should return to her room," Edward said, dismissing the housekeeper with practiced authority. When they were alone, the old man's facade of casual interest dropped. "And you're in grave danger, child," he said quietly. "Hezekiah plans to accelerate the wedding timeline. The announcement will appear in Saturday's newspaper." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. "But there's been no formal proposal. The arrangement with your aunt constitutes a binding contract in his view. The ceremony is set for 3 weeks hence." "I can't," Charlotte began, her voice breaking. "Listen carefully," Edward interrupted, glancing at the door. "Hezekiah leaves tomorrow for Charleston on business. It's your only opportunity." From within his waistcoat, he produced a small key and a folded letter. "This opens the garden gate. Take only what you can carry inconspicuously." The letter contains instructions and enough money to secure passage north. "Why would you help me?" Charlotte whispered, concealing the items in her sleeve. Edward's expression softened. I failed to protect others from my nephew's cruelty. Perhaps this small act might balance the ledger before I meet my maker. That night Charlotte barely slept, her mind racing between hope and terror. If she escaped, what would happen to Abigail and Mary? But if she remained and became Hezekiah's wife, what horrors awaited all three of them? Dawn brought reports that Hezekiah had indeed departed for Charleston. By mid-morning, Charlotte had hidden a change of clothes and Edward's money beneath her shawl. As she made her way toward the garden, a familiar voice froze her in place. "Going somewhere, Miss Thornwell?" Thomas Cooper stepped from an adjoining room, blocking her path. Charlotte forced herself to remain calm. "Just to the garden for fresh air, Mr. Cooper." Mrs. Winthrop granted permission. Cooper's smile never reached his eyes. "Strange you'd need such a bundle for a simple turn around the garden." Before Charlotte could respond, the front door burst open. A young slave woman rushed in, her expression frantic. "Fire in the stables, Mr. Cooper. The horses?" Cooper hesitated, torn between his suspicion of Charlotte and the emergency. "Stay where you are," he ordered, before rushing toward the commotion. Charlotte seized the moment, slipping through the side door and into the garden. The key worked smoothly in the gate's lock, and suddenly she was in a narrow alley behind the mansion. Following Edward's instructions, she made her way toward the docks, keeping her head down and her pace unhurried despite the pounding of her heart. The harbor teemed with activity, sailors loading cargo, merchants haggling over prices, travelers boarding vessels bound for ports along the Atlantic coast. Charlotte located the ship Edward had identified, the Northern Star, its decks busy with pre-departure preparations. As she approached the gangplank, a rough hand seized her arm. "Found you!" Cooper hissed in her ear. "Your little distraction with the stables was clever but inadequate." Charlotte's cry for help was lost in the harbor's noise as Cooper dragged her toward a waiting carriage. Just as he forced her inside, a commanding voice cut through the commotion. "Release that young woman immediately!" A uniformed officer approached, flanked by two armed men. Cooper's grip tightened painfully. "This is a private matter, sir. The girl is under my employer's protection." "I have a warrant regarding illegal activities at the Blackwood property," the officer replied, producing an official document. "And this young lady may have information pertinent to our investigation." Cooper's hesitation gave Charlotte the opening she needed. Twisting from his grasp, she stumbled toward the officers. "He's involved in illegal slave trading. There's evidence in the cellars of the Blackwood mansion." The officer steadied Charlotte, then signaled his men to apprehend Cooper, who was already reaching for a concealed weapon. "Miss Thornwell, I presume? We received intelligence about your situation from a most unexpected source." As Cooper was restrained and led away, Charlotte turned back toward the Northern Star. On its deck stood Edward Blackwood, leaning heavily on a cane but smiling with genuine warmth. He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, then turned to speak with a young woman who stood beside him, a woman who, even at a distance, bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of Hezekiah's late wife that hung in the mansion's drawing room. "Margaret Blackwood's sister," the officer explained, following Charlotte's gaze. "She's been gathering evidence against her brother-in-law for years after suspecting foul play in her sister's death." As the reality of her narrow escape washed over her, Charlotte gripped the officer's arm. "My sisters are still at Willow Creek with my aunt. They need protection immediately." "Already underway, Miss Thornwell. Another detachment was dispatched this morning." In that moment, standing amid the chaos of Savannah's harbor, Charlotte felt something she had almost forgotten: the first fragile stirrings of hope. The journey north to Philadelphia took 17 days, a period of suspended animation during which Charlotte existed between worlds. The ship rolled beneath her feet as timbers creaked and salt spray misted through open portholes. She shared cramped quarters with 3 other women: a missionary's widow returning from the West Indies, a seamstress seeking employment in the North, and a quiet older woman who said little but watched everything with shrewd eyes. "You're running from something," the older woman, Mrs. Harlow, observed on their 7th night at sea, speaking low enough that only Charlotte could hear. "What makes you say that?" Charlotte asked, fingers automatically reaching for the locket containing miniature portraits of her sisters. Mrs. Harlow's smile held no judgment. "I recognize the look. I wore it myself once." Gradually, Charlotte shared her story, not all of it, but enough. Mrs. Harlow had connections in Philadelphia's abolitionist circles and promised introductions upon their arrival. "There are people who can help locate your sisters, if authorities haven't already secured their safety." When they finally docked in Philadelphia, Charlotte stepped onto northern soil for the first time, the September air crisp with autumn's approach. The city's bustle overwhelmed her senses after weeks at sea. The clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the sheer variety of accents and languages surrounding her. Mrs. Harlow guided Charlotte to a modest boarding house run by a Quaker woman named Ruth Pennington, who offered refuge to women in difficult circumstances. "Stay here while we make inquiries," Mrs. Harlow advised. "Philadelphia has eyes and ears that reach far into the South." Days stretched into weeks as Charlotte waited for news. She occupied herself by assisting Ruth with the boarding house accounts and teaching basic literacy to a young Irish maid who wanted to write letters home. Each evening she scanned the newspapers for mentions of the Blackwood investigation, finding only brief references to irregularities in certain Savannah shipping operations. On a rain-soaked Tuesday in early October, Charlotte returned from the market to find Ruth waiting in the entrance hall, her normally composed features animated with excitement. "A telegram arrived while you were out," the older woman announced, pressing the paper into Charlotte's hand. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she read the terse message. "Subject secure. Stop arriving. Philadelphia. October 14th. Stop. Meet Central Station. Noon. Stop Marshall." "They're alive," Charlotte whispered, tears blurring the words. "My sisters are coming here." Ruth squeezed her shoulder gently. "God's mercy knows no boundaries, child. Now let's prepare for their arrival." The next 10 days passed in a flurry of activity as Charlotte helped ready accommodations for Abigail and Mary. Ruth's connections secured additional space in a neighboring house, while Mrs. Harlow arranged introductions to families who might provide employment or educational opportunities. On October 14th, Charlotte stood on the platform at Central Station, heart pounding as each incoming train discharged its passengers. When the noon train from Baltimore finally arrived, billowing steam across the platform, she scanned the crowd with desperate intensity. "Charlotte!" The voice cut through the station's cacophony like a beacon through fog. Mary burst from the crowd, her face thinner than Charlotte remembered, but alight with joy. Behind her came Abigail, more subdued but smiling, accompanied by a stern-faced man whom Charlotte recognized as the federal marshal who had intervened at Savannah's harbor. The reunion dissolved into tears and laughter as the sisters clung to each other. When they finally separated, Marshal Jennings provided the explanation Charlotte had been awaiting. "We arrived at Willow Creek 2 days after your escape," he explained as they settled in a quiet corner of the station. "Your aunt had already fled, taking what valuables she could carry. The overseer, Cooper's associate, resisted arrest and was shot in the ensuing confrontation." "And the people enslaved at Willow Creek?" Charlotte asked. "Under protection of the court until ownership is legally determined. Evidence suggests your father intended emancipation for many." Abigail squeezed Charlotte's hand. "Father's lawyer had copies of documents Aunt Elizabeth claimed were lost. He's been helping the authorities." "What about Hezekiah Blackwood?" Charlotte asked, the name still sending a chill through her. Marshal Jennings' expression darkened. "Arrested upon his return to Savannah. The evidence recovered from his cellars was substantial. The trial is set for December, though I doubt he'll face the full consequences his crimes deserve. Men of his standing rarely do." That evening, in the safety of Ruth Pennington's parlor, Abigail and Mary filled in the gaps of their experience after Charlotte's departure. Elizabeth's cruelty had intensified, particularly toward Mary, who had been confined to the attic after attempting to warn Hannah about plans to sell her newborn twins. "She told everyone in Savannah society that you'd had a nervous collapse," Abigail explained, "that you were receiving treatment with the Blackwoods before the wedding." Mary, curled beside Charlotte on the sofa, added, "The night before the marshals came, I overheard her with that horrible overseer. They were planning to declare me unstable too, since no suitable offers had come for Abigail." Charlotte held her sisters closer, the full scope of their narrow escape washing over her. "We're safe now," she whispered, though the words felt fragile against the magnitude of what they'd endured. Later, alone with Ruth in the kitchen, Charlotte confronted the reality of their situation. "We have no home, no income, no protector by society's standards. How do we build a life from nothing?" Ruth's weathered hands continued kneading bread dough with steady rhythm. "You have education, intelligence, and each other. In Philadelphia, that's not nothing." She looked up, her gaze direct. "The path won't be easy, but you'd be surprised how many have walked it before you and found their way to something better than mere survival." That night, Charlotte wrote in her new journal, a gift from Mrs. Harlow to replace the one Elizabeth had burned. In careful script, she recorded their story as she knew it thus far, determined that the truth would not be lost to time or convenient erasure. "The Thornwell sisters do not end here," she wrote as midnight approached. "This is merely the beginning of a different story than the one prescribed for us, and this time we will be the authors." Philadelphia in late autumn revealed a different face to the Thornwell sisters than Savannah had ever shown. The city moved at a relentless pace, industrial, commercial, intellectual, with little patience for southern gentility or leisure. While cold rain lashed the windows of their modest rooms, Charlotte, Abigail, and Mary confronted the practicalities of their new existence. "We have enough funds for approximately 3 months," Charlotte explained one evening, reviewing the financial assistance provided by the federal authorities as partial restitution, while the Willow Creek case proceeded through the courts. "After that, we must be self-sufficient." Mary, who had always been shielded from such concerns, looked stricken. "What can we possibly do? We weren't trained for anything useful." "That's not entirely true," Abigail countered, her natural pragmatism emerging. "Charlotte writes beautifully. I have some skill with numbers and household management, and you, Mary, have your music." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "Father's education was more comprehensive than most girls receive. We simply need to translate that into marketable abilities." Within a week, their plan took shape. Charlotte secured a position as a copyist with a local publisher through Ruth Pennington's connections. The work was tedious, transcribing manuscripts into clean copy for the typesetters, but it provided steady income and access to Philadelphia's literary circles. Abigail, displaying unexpected assertiveness, approached the owner of a respectable dry goods establishment who had been lamenting his bookkeeping challenges within Ruth's hearing. Her demonstration of accounting skills earned her 3 afternoons of work weekly, with the promise of more if she proved competent. Mary's path proved more challenging. At 14, she was too young for formal employment, yet old enough to feel the burden of dependency. The solution came unexpectedly when she befriended the young daughter of their landlady, who struggled with her piano lessons. "I could teach beginners," Mary proposed, after successfully guiding the child through a simple piece. "Children from families who can't afford the prestigious music instructors." By Thanksgiving, the sisters had established a tenuous foothold in Philadelphia society, not as debutantes or potential brides, but as working women whose skills carried modest value in the marketplace. Their circle expanded beyond Ruth's boarding house to include other independent women, a widowed seamstress, a female physician who had studied in Europe, and several teachers from the local Quaker school. "You're fortunate to have arrived when you did," Dr. Eleanor Blackwell remarked during a Sunday afternoon gathering at the physician's home. 20 years ago, your options would have been far more limited." Charlotte, who had been revising a manuscript on women's health that Dr. Blackwell hoped to publish, looked up with interest. "Are things truly changing so much?" "Incrementally," the doctor replied, "though never fast enough for those caught in the transition." The conversation turned to the growing women's rights movement, with heated debate about the recent Seneca Falls Convention and its controversial declaration of sentiments. Charlotte listened intently, recognizing a framework for understanding the injustices she had experienced, not as isolated personal misfortunes, but as systematic inequities embedded in law and custom. That evening, walking home through streets illuminated by newly installed gas lamps, Charlotte felt a shift in her perception. The terror of their escape from Georgia had receded somewhat, replaced by tentative aspirations beyond mere survival. "I've been invited to attend a lecture series at the Franklin Institute," she told her sisters as they prepared for bed in their shared room. "Dr. Blackwell says they occasionally admit women, though we must sit separately." Abigail smiled, removing pins from her hair. "Mr. Hanover offered me additional hours at the store. His business is expanding, and he values my methodical approach," as he put it. Mary, already in her nightgown, sat cross-legged on the bed they shared. "Mrs. Pennington says I may use the parlor for music lessons 3 afternoons weekly. She thinks it will attract respectable boarders." Their modest triumphs created a moment of quiet joy, interrupted by a knock at their door. Ruth stood outside, her expression grave. "A telegram arrived for you, Charlotte, from Savannah." The yellow paper trembled in Charlotte's hands as she read, "Blackwood escaped custody, stop Cooper, still at large, stop exercise, extreme caution, stop Marshall." The room's warmth seemed to vanish instantly. Mary clutched Abigail's arm, while Charlotte read the message twice more, as if the words might rearrange themselves into less threatening configurations. "What does this mean for us?" Abigail finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte folded the telegram with deliberate care. "It means our past isn't as far behind us as we hoped." Ruth, who had remained in the doorway, stepped forward. "I'll alert our friends in the community. There are precautions we can take." The following days brought new routines shaped by heightened vigilance. The sisters, never traveled alone, varied their routes between home and work, and maintained regular communication with a network of allies. Dr. Blackwell arranged for a burly medical student to escort Charlotte home from late publishing sessions, while Mr. Hanover insisted Abigail use the store's delivery wagon rather than walking. Despite these protections, anxiety seeped into their daily lives, a constant undercurrent beneath their growing adaptation to northern urban life. Charlotte found herself scanning crowds for familiar southern faces, while Mary developed the habit of checking window locks multiple times before sleeping. "We can't live like this indefinitely," Charlotte declared, after a particularly difficult week when rumors of southern men making inquiries in their neighborhood had prompted them to remain indoors for 2 days. "We need more definitive information." Through Dr. Blackwell's connections, Charlotte arranged correspondence with a sympathetic journalist in Savannah who provided discreet updates on the Blackwood case. His letters painted a disturbing picture of corruption and obstruction surrounding the investigation. "Blackwood's wealth has purchased significant loyalty," read one dispatch. "Witnesses recant, evidence disappears, and officials suddenly develop convenient lapses in memory. Justice moves with painful slowness when opposed by such resources." On a bitter January morning, as Charlotte waited at the Franklin Institute for a lecture on recent innovations in steam power, a portly gentleman in a fine wool coat approached her seat in the women's section. "Miss Thornwell, I presume?" he inquired, his Boston accent pronounced. "Samuel Gardner. I've been corresponding with Marshal Jennings regarding your situation." Charlotte tensed, glancing toward the exits. Gardner noticed her apprehension and continued in a lower voice. "I represent certain northern industrial interests seeking investment opportunities in the rebuilding of southern infrastructure following the eventual resolution of regional tensions. I don't understand what this has to do with me, Charlotte replied cautiously. Gardner's smile was brief but genuine. Your father's plantation occupies a strategic location near proposed railway expansions. Our consortium is prepared to purchase Willow Creek at a fair price once legal ownership is clearly established. This would provide you and your sisters with financial security and, most pertinently, remove any economic motive for harassment from those who currently covet your inheritance. The proposition was unexpected but not unwelcome. By February, through a complex legal arrangement involving northern attorneys and southern proxies, negotiations for the sale of Willow Creek began. Charlotte insisted on two non-negotiable conditions: fair compensation for the enslaved people who would receive their freedom when the sale concluded, and prosecution of Elizabeth Thornwell for her criminal conspiracy with Hezekiah Blackwood. Your conditions make this transaction considerably more complicated, Gardner observed during a meeting at his hotel suite where Abigail had insisted on accompanying Charlotte. Justice often complicates business, Charlotte replied evenly, but I believe your consortium will still find the arrangement profitable. As winter yielded reluctantly to spring, the Thornwell sisters established a new normal. Their work provided modest but stable income. Their social circle expanded through church and intellectual gatherings, and the immediate threat from Savannah seemed to recede as legal processes advanced. Then, on a mild April afternoon, Charlotte returned from the publishing house to find Ruth waiting at the entrance to the boarding house, her expression a mixture of concern and suppressed excitement. "You have visitors," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "They're waiting in the parlor." Charlotte stepped inside, momentarily blinded by the transition from bright spring sunshine to the dimmer interior. When her vision adjusted, she found herself facing Edward Blackwood and a young woman she didn't recognize. "Forgive the unexpected intrusion," Edward said, rising from his seat with the aid of his cane. But circumstances necessitated discretion. The young woman stood as well, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine Blackwood, Hezekiah's daughter. We need your help, and I believe we can offer assistance in return." The parlor of Ruth Pennington's boarding house had witnessed many serious conversations, but few as consequential as the one unfolding that April afternoon. Charlotte sat rigid on the horsehair sofa, studying Catherine Blackwood, a slender young woman of perhaps 20, with intelligent eyes that reminded Charlotte uncomfortably of Hezekiah. "My father has reconstituted his network," Catherine explained, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "Not just the illegal trading operations, but his political alliances and business connections. The charges against him will almost certainly be dismissed by summer." Edward Blackwood, looking frailer than Charlotte remembered, nodded grimly. "Witnesses have been intimidated or bribed. Evidence has disappeared from official custody. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was suddenly reassigned to Minnesota territory." Charlotte's hands clenched in her lap. "And Elizabeth Thornwell?" "Released on bail arranged by an anonymous benefactor," Catherine replied. "She's been seen regularly at my father's Savannah residence." The implications settled like a physical weight. Despite their precautions, their distance, their growing roots in Philadelphia, the threat had not diminished. It had merely regrouped. "Why have you come to us?" Charlotte asked, suspicion edging her tone. "Catherine, you're Hezekiah's daughter. Why would you betray your own father?" Catherine's composure fractured slightly, revealing a glimpse of buried pain. "My sister Margaret died last year at our boarding school in Charleston. The official report claimed typhoid fever, but I received a letter from her friend describing symptoms consistent with poisoning." Her voice hardened. 2 weeks earlier, Margaret had written to me about discovering documents in our father's study during holiday leave. Documents detailing how our mother had been systematically poisoned when she began questioning his business practices. Edward placed a steadying hand on Catherine's shoulder. "Hezekiah considers his children as property, assets to be deployed for advantage or eliminated if they become liabilities. Catherine became inconvenient when she began asking questions about her sister's death. Ruth, who had been silently observing, spoke for the first time. "You're in danger yourself now." "Immediate danger," Catherine confirmed. "I fled Charleston 3 weeks ago when I learned my father had arranged a marriage for me to one of his business associates, a man 40 years my senior with a reputation for disciplining young wives into early graves." Charlotte exchanged glances with Ruth, recognizing the familiar pattern, the same fate Elizabeth had planned for her with Blackwood himself. "What do you propose?" Charlotte finally asked. Edward withdrew several folded papers from his coat. "We have evidence, financial records, correspondence, shipping manifests, documenting not only the illegal slave trading, but extensive bribery of officials. Independently, these documents are insufficient, but combined with what the federal investigators already have, why not take this directly to the authorities?" Charlotte challenged. Catherine's laugh held no humor. "We tried. The first marshal we approached was on my father's payroll. We barely escaped the meeting." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "But your connection with Marshal Jennings provides a direct line to those in the Justice Department who remain uncorrupted." And then, the proposal they outlined was audacious and dangerous. Charlotte would use her established communication channel with Marshal Jennings to arrange a secure transfer of evidence, while Catherine would provide testimony about her father's criminal operations, including details only an insider could know. After they It could be an elaborate trap, Abigail pointed out, always the most cautious of the three. What if Catherine is actually working for her father, trying to draw us out? Mary, who had grown remarkably in the months since their escape, shook her head. "I believe her story. The pattern matches everything we experienced with Aunt Elizabeth: the control, the disposal of inconvenient women, the corruption of authorities." Charlotte paced the small room, weighing possibilities and consequences. "If we do nothing, Blackwood and Elizabeth eventually will find us. If we act and fail, we accelerate that confrontation. And if we succeed," Abigail asked softly, "then perhaps we truly can begin anew," Charlotte replied, "without constantly looking over our shoulders." The next morning brought unexpected complications, when Charlotte's publisher assigned her to a rushed transcription project requiring late hours for the coming week. Abigail volunteered to meet with Catherine instead, arguing that her afternoon schedule at the dry goods store offered more flexibility. "I don't like dividing our forces," Charlotte fretted as Abigail prepared to leave for the designated meeting place, a small Quaker meeting house where Catherine had arranged temporary sanctuary. "We're stronger when we pursue multiple paths," Abigail replied with newfound confidence. "Besides, I've always been the better judge of character." 3 days passed in a flurry of coordinated activities. Charlotte drafted carefully coded messages to Marshal Jennings, while Abigail met regularly with Catherine to compile and organize the evidence. Mary, proving unexpectedly resourceful, established a network of lookouts among the neighborhood children she tutored in music, offering small rewards for reports of strangers asking questions about the Thornwell sisters. On Thursday evening, as Charlotte walked home from the publishing house, accompanied by Dr. Blackwell's medical student, one of Mary's young sentinels, raced up to them, breathless with urgency. "Miss Charlotte, men asking about you at Wilson's Tavern, southern men with fancy clothes." Charlotte pressed a penny into the boy's hand. "Thank you, Timothy. Go straight home now." Rather than returning to the boarding house, Charlotte directed her escort to Dr. Blackwell's residence, where an emergency gathering assembled within the hour. Catherine arrived last, escorted by 2 burly Quaker men who had appointed themselves her protectors. "The timeline has accelerated," Charlotte announced to the assembled allies. "Blackwood's men are in Philadelphia. We need to move the evidence and Catherine to federal custody immediately." Dr. Blackwell, whose composure remained unshakable even in crisis, outlined the adjusted plan. "I've received word that Marshal Jennings can meet us in Baltimore tomorrow. I have arranged medical credentials for Catherine to travel as my assistant, with the documents concealed in medical texts. What about your sisters? Catherine asked Charlotte. They'll remain here under protection, Charlotte replied firmly. I won't risk all of us on the same journey. The room erupted in overlapping objections, Abigail insisting on accompanying Charlotte, Mary refusing to be left behind, Ruth arguing for different safe houses for each sister. Finally, Edward Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. They know Charlotte's face best, he stated with grim authority. She's the primary target. The sisters should take separate routes to Baltimore, with different companions and disguises. By midnight, the revised strategy was set. Charlotte would travel openly by train with Dr. Blackwell and Catherine, deliberately drawing attention as a decoy. Meanwhile, Abigail would journey by private carriage with Edward along back roads, carrying the actual evidence. Mary, despite vehement protests, would remain in Philadelphia under the protection of Ruth's extensive Quaker network until word came that the others had reached safety. As dawn broke on Friday, Charlotte embraced her sisters in the boarding-house kitchen, the familiar scent of Ruth's baking surrounding them one last time before their separation. 3 days, Charlotte promised, holding Mary's tear-streaked face between her palms. 3 days, and this will end. The journey began according to plan. Charlotte boarded the morning train with Dr. Blackwell and Catherine, all three dressed as befitted a respected physician, traveling with female relatives. From the corner of her eye, Charlotte noted 2 well-dressed men boarding the same car, their southern accents audible as they discussed timber investments loudly enough to be overheard. For 2 hours, the game of silent observation continued. The southern men maintained casual conversation while periodically glancing toward Charlotte's party. Dr. Blackwell appeared engrossed in a medical journal, while Catherine stared demurely out the window. Charlotte pretended to doze, her every sense alert to the subtle chess match unfolding in the swaying train car. At Wilmington Station, where passengers disembarked for refreshments, the dynamic shifted. One of the men approached Charlotte directly, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Thornwell, isn't it? Thomas Cooper sends his regards." Charlotte felt Catherine tense beside her, but maintained her composure. "I believe you're mistaken, sir. My name is Bennett, Dr. Bennett's niece." And the man smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "My mistake, ma'am. You bear a remarkable resemblance to someone of my acquaintance." He retreated to rejoin his companion, who was now watching them with undisguised interest. "They know," Catherine whispered as they reboarded. "Somehow they know." Dr. Blackwell's expression remained impassive. "Stay calm. The Baltimore station will have federal agents waiting. We're simply the distraction, remember?" As the train approached the Maryland border, Charlotte's thoughts turned to Abigail and Edward, traveling separately with the crucial evidence. Had they encountered similar surveillance? Were they safely ahead, or had their slower mode of transportation placed them at greater risk? The train whistle pierced her reflections as they approached the final scheduled stop before Baltimore. Charlotte glanced out the window at the small rural station, little more than a platform beside a water tower where the train would replenish its supply. As the train slowed, she noticed unusual activity on the platform. Several men in nondescript clothing positioned at intervals, their attention focused intently on the approaching train. When the Goldtooth's companion rose abruptly and moved toward the rear of the car, a cold certainty settled in Charlotte's stomach. "They're going to take us here," she murmured to Dr. Blackwell. "Before we reach Baltimore." The physician nodded almost imperceptibly, then leaned close to Catherine. "When I create the distraction, you both move forward through the cars. Don't stop. Don't look back." Before Charlotte could ask what distraction, the train jerked to its final halt. Goldtooth rose, hand slipping inside his jacket. In the same moment, Dr. Blackwell surged to her feet, swinging her heavy medical bag in a wide arc that caught the man squarely in the face. "Now!" she shouted as chaos erupted in the car. Charlotte grabbed Catherine's arm, pulling her toward the forward exit as passengers scattered in confusion. Behind them, Dr. Blackwell's voice rose in command, invoking medical authority to control the situation she had created. The two young women pushed through connecting doors into the next car, then the next, moving against the flow of curious passengers heading toward the commotion. Charlotte caught glimpses of the platform through windows as they passed, men attempting to board while the conductor blocked their way, demanding identification. "Almost there!" Charlotte gasped as they reached the forward passenger car. Beyond it lay only the tender and engine. As they burst through the final door, the engineer turned in surprise, his face smudged with coal dust. "Ladies, you can't be here." "Federal business," Catherine declared with remarkable authority. "Those men attempting to board are fugitives from justice." Whether convinced by her tone or simply confused, the engineer hesitated long enough for Charlotte to spot what she sought: a maintenance ladder leading to the roof of the tender. "Up!" she commanded Catherine, boosting her toward the rungs. "We'll cross over." As Catherine climbed, shouts from behind confirmed their pursuers had broken through. Charlotte followed quickly, emerging onto the tender's roof, with wind whipping her hair free from its pins. The coal dust immediately blackened her gloves as she helped Catherine navigate across the tender toward the first passenger car's roof. Below, the platform had descended into chaos. Through the disarray, Charlotte spotted a welcome sight: federal marshals' badges flashing in the sun as agents surrounded Blackwood's men. Dr. Blackwell stood beside the conductor, gesturing emphatically toward the front of the train. "They made it," Charlotte breathed as she helped Catherine down through the maintenance hatch of the passenger car. The real marshals arrived. Inside the car, they found themselves facing a startled porter who took in their disheveled appearance with remarkable composure. "I believe there are some gentlemen looking for you, miss." "Federal marshals?" Charlotte asked hopefully. The porter's expression confirmed her fears before he spoke. "No, miss, Southern gentleman, very determined. Said it was a family matter." The realization struck like physical blow. The men on the platform had been a feint. The real threat remained on board, waiting for their desperate flight forward. "Is there another way off the train?" Catherine asked urgently. The porter hesitated only briefly before making his decision. "Baggage car, 2 cars back. They're unloading mail parcels on the blind side of the platform." With a quick prayer that the porter's sympathy was genuine, Charlotte and Catherine moved cautiously back through the train, hugging the wall opposite the platform side windows. They reached the baggage car just as postal workers finished transferring heavy mail bags. "Please," Charlotte addressed the nearest worker, not bothering to hide her desperation. "We need to leave the train without using the platform." The worker frowned, but his companion, older, with kind eyes beneath bushy brows, gestured toward a small door on the opposite side. "My daughter's about your age," he said simply. "Whatever trouble you're in, I hope you find your way clear of it." Moments later, they stood in tall grass beside the tracks, the train blocking them from view of the platform. Ahead lay woods, offering potential concealment, but reaching them would require crossing an exposed stretch of field. "When I count 3, Charlotte whispered, "we run. Don't stop until we reach those trees." They made it halfway to the woods when a shout from behind announced their discovery. Charlotte glanced back to see Goldtooth and another man descending from the train, their intentions clear in the weapons now openly displayed. The distance to the trees seemed impossibly vast, their legs leaden with exhaustion and terror. A shot cracked the air, sending birds scattering from nearby branches. Catherine stumbled and Charlotte caught her arm, dragging her forward on pure desperation. The woods loomed closer, offering tantalizing promise of concealment, when the thunder of hooves drew Charlotte's attention to their left. A carriage approached at dangerous speed along the rutted country road that paralleled the tracks at a distance. "They're cutting us off," Catherine gasped. "We'll never make it." Charlotte's reply died in her throat as the carriage swerved toward them, and a familiar voice called out, "Charlotte, here!" Abigail stood in the moving carriage, one hand extended, while Edward Blackwood struggled with the reins. Behind them, Marshal Jennings and another agent braced themselves against the carriage's wild motion. With a final desperate surge, Charlotte and Catherine reached the road as the carriage slowed just enough for them to scramble aboard. Marshal Jennings immediately fired toward their pursuers, forcing them to seek cover. "The evidence?" Charlotte gasped as Abigail hugged her fiercely. "Safe with federal authorities in Baltimore," Marshal Jennings confirmed. "Your sister delivered it yesterday. We were on our way to extract you when we received intelligence about the ambush." As the carriage careened toward the main road, Charlotte looked back at the diminishing figures of Blackwood's men, now frantically returning to the train. For the first time since fleeing Savannah, she felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "It's over," she whispered, though part of her couldn't yet believe it. "It's finally over." Marshal Jennings' expression sobered. "Not quite yet, Miss Thornwell, but we're closer than we've ever been. This was only the beginning. The darkness continues in part 2. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.